Growing up in India is a fascinating experience with such a rich culture, diverse practices, various religions, different schools of thought, and spiritual traditions. And it reflects in day to day living as well. For instance, we were to take the recent festival that happened a couple of weeks back, the Makara Sankranti. If you were to go down to the south, you would see these beautiful geometric patterns drawn outside all the houses. One would have to think it's called kolam in Tamil Nadu, but it's drawn across South India in most parts. And you would have to ask this question as to why would someone want to draw these beautiful, they look beautiful, but is there any larger purpose to it? These beautiful patterns that are drawn with rice flour. Or for instance, if we were to go to the temples, the central idea or the intent behind going to the temples, or the temples as they were made, was to transcend the profane into the sacred. But if you were to go to temples across India, right from obviously the Khajuraho or the Sun Temple in Konark, but even if you were to come down to the south, and maybe Virupaksha Temple in Hampi or the Satya Perumal Temple in Tamil Nadu, you would still see panels or sculptures depicting the erotic in these beautiful ancient temples. So one would have to again ask the question as to what was the point behind it, and is there a way to reconcile what is being depicted in art? So what would that mean? Or for instance, we go further, even in terms of a value system, compassion and sensitivity is held as a very cherished value that we all grow into, and that's very much part of the Indian tradition. Ahimsa, of course, encapsulate that. But then, if you were to take the Shakta tradition, for instance, which is basically the worship of the divine feminine, and there are so many different manifestations of the divine feminine, the mother goddess. So if you were to worship, for instance, the goddess Lalita Tripura Sundari or Kamalatmika, for instance, the worship, the rituals are highly sattvic. But then, for instance, if you were to go to Kamakya or Kalighat, you would worship a form of goddess like Mahakali with animal sacrifice. Then the question obviously comes as to how do you reconcile the two? At one point, there is a very cherished value of ahimsa. On the other hand, we also worship in the Hindu tradition, or the Sanatana Dharma more precisely, we have the Shakta tradition in some forms worshipping with animal sacrifice. Then the question comes as to how do you reconcile this? Or for instance, even if you take in terms of spiritual thought, one of the most fundamental premises in the Indian tradition is about the concept of dharma, and that's reflected in the way the karmic principle also eventually works. Right. Now then the question comes as to, if we talk about dharma and karma, we also have a tradition where, even going back to the age of Lord Rama in the Ramayana, you had a minister of the king Dasharatha, Jabali, convincing or trying to convince Lord Rama with an argument that essentially atheistic, Nastika, where he talks about essentially going with inferences drawn from direct sources of perception to sense perception, what you see, and we draw inferences and not base our principles on something that is not seen, something that's going beyond this lifetime. He even talks and argues saying that there's no point doing the ritual offerings to the mains or the Pitrus, the Shradam as we call it. Of course, Lord Rama refutes it eventually and does not buy his argument. But the point here is you have such a diverse tradition which is pretty much covering all different parts of the spectrum at all levels, daily practices, your value system, in terms of your aesthetics, in terms of the spiritual philosophies. You have a range of practices and traditions. Then it obviously brings a lot of questions. How do you reconcile this complexity, and is there a way to understand it? If one were to closely observe, there seem to be certain cues and hints that kind of lead us to ask, pursue a thread, and possibly find answers for ourselves. Like, for instance, we were to go and visit these temples, these magnificent temples in the south. For instance, you go to the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjore, and you go and look at the way the temple has been planned, has been designed. Or for instance, if you were to go to the Lingaraj temple in Orissa, or the Kandariya Mahadev temple in Khajuraho, these are temples in different parts of India, but they seem to have, and they look very different. The aesthetic appeal is different. But if you were to really observe closely, you would see certain common principles, and that's very clear. There's no missing that. There's a very clear set of common principles based on which these temples have been designed, and they all seem to be drawing from the Sthapatya Veda, where these principles are clearly delineated. So in that sense, the Sthapatya Veda becomes like a horizontal. It's a common thread running across with certain common principles, and irrespective of how the apparent aesthetic appeal is different, still they retain certain commonality in terms of principles. Similarly, you could take some of the other bodies of knowledge like Ayurveda. Basically it's the science of life. It talks about harmonizing the body with the environment in a holistic way. Or for instance, we were to take the Vedanga or the limb of the Vedas, in the instance of Jyotisha or Vedic Astrology. It's a very powerful way of understanding and pursuing this common thread, because the ambit of Jyotisha is basically something that ties something at a cosmic level to the mundane. So you could pursue it from any point, but there seem to be certain common threads, and these common threads also converge at some point. These common threads, or these bodies of knowledge that I was talking about, they are self-sufficient, but they also seem to be in a way designed to answer larger questions and becoming part of a contiguous whole. And there are of course so many questions that wouldn't get asked, particularly growing up in India. Like, you go through your daily life at a transactional level, at a mundane level, but also you have these cues given to you which make you or provokes you to think about larger questions. For instance, you could have questions about the cosmology, right? You could have questions about the universe, or are there more universes? There are many universes. And these are questions that seem to be already looked into, and answers have also been given for us to at least consider and explore. The concept of lokas, for instance. You could have a question on the nature of the universe, or the stuff that the universe is made up of, or nature is made up of. The concept of tattvas and gunas have been spoken about. Or, for instance, a question of the manifestations of the divine. This has again been spoken about and explored in great detail. Talk about the Adityas in great detail, about the various forms of Adityas or the sun, or the Jyotirlingas, or the Mahavidyas, or the Dashavataras of Mahavishnu, and so on. So each one is a universe by itself, if you were to understand, but it also forms part of a contiguous whole. Or, for instance, one can ask about the principles in which the universe operates. So in the Siddha traditional, they delineate clearly 96 principles based on which the universe is conceived and it works. It's been explained in detail. Or, for instance, if you were to talk about the concept, what are the rules of engagement with nature? So the concept of karma comes into play, which is a very nuanced philosophy. In fact, because when you talk about karma, you have to talk about dharma, or a contextual appropriateness, if you were to put it that way, or being correct according to the context, which is not an easy thing to understand. So you have the epic of Mahabharata. As epic as Mahabharata is in terms of a story and the complexity of the story and the many characters, it seems to be an epic understanding of the concept of dharma. Or, for instance, if you were to go and ask questions in terms of how do you perceive the divine, and are there many forms of divinity in terms of the experience, then we have the states of consciousness given, and in the way we perceive the divine in these various states of consciousness. Or is there a way in which there's a roadmap to the evolution of the soul? That's again been explored in detail. Patanjali Maharishi has given us the Ashtanga Yoga, which is essentially like a roadmap for the evolution of the soul. And so many questions that one can have. All of these questions perhaps need to be asked, and it looks like these questions have been answered in great detail in this long tradition, very ancient Indian tradition. And there have been many great thinkers, and the least that we could do is try and ask these questions and find answers for it. I'm sure you've had some of these questions too, or perhaps more. And these are the questions that I have sought answers for as well. And my search led me to many fascinating sources of knowledge, places, people, and I'd like to share some of these perspectives on what is essentially ephemeral and perhaps elusive. And some people call it nature, some people call it the process, some people choose to call it the divine, some might call it God. You can call it whatever you prefer, but I'd like to call it the beautiful. So join me every Friday as I try and unravel the inner codes of the beautiful. My name is Vallikanth.